Okay, welcome everybody to the Northeast Philadelphia History Network monthly meeting. My name is Jack McCarthy. The network is sponsored by the Friends of Northeast Philadelphia History, a 501c3 nonprofit, one of many activities that we do, these monthly meetings. We have monthly meetings the first Wednesday evening of every month. We usually meet at Pennypack Baptist Church, the historic church in Bustleton, and do a hybrid both in person and Zoom. But tonight we're just doing completely virtual, only Zoom. So nobody is at Pennypack Baptist tonight. But generally, we're there the first Wednesday evening of every month and through Zoom. Just a very quick rundown of the future meetings on again the first Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. February 4th, we're going to have a program about the Bucks County African American History Museum in honor of Black History Month. March 4th, there's going to be a talk on Lydia Dara, the hero of the Revolution, for Women's History Month. In April, we're going to have a program on Civil War veterans in Northeast Philadelphia cemeteries. April 11th, which is a Saturday, we're having our biennial, every other year, Northeast Philadelphia History Fair at Constadter's in the Northeast. That's a big event. We have, dozens of local history organizations and historians and historic sites have tables. We have presentations and activities. So that's Saturday, April 11th from 10 to 3. So mark your calendars for that. And then we'll talk about the May and June programs at another time. But that's the lineup for the coming months. And everybody, again, please mute yourself. And and you can put questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end, both through chat, and sometimes we can unmute somebody to ask a question. So we're delighted tonight to have Tom Keels speaking on his book Sesqui, Greed, Graft, and the Forgotten World's Fair of 1926, which, as you will hear, was, I guess the word would be ill-fated, would be putting it moderately. As we approach, the celebrations for the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary coming up this summer, it's cool to look back and see what happened in prior celebrations of American anniversary. So that's what we're going to hear tonight. Tom is an author, lecturer, and commentator specializing in Philadelphia history, cemeteries, and architecture. Besides Sesqui, he is the author or co-author of 6 published books, including Wicked Philadelphia, Sin in the City of Brotherly Love, Forgotten Philadelphia, Lost Architecture of the Quaker City, and Philadelphia Graveyards and Cemeteries. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tom, and let's hear about this fiasco of 1926.
Thank you very much, Jack. It's very nice of you to. I appreciate the introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm very happy to be here to talk about Philadelphia's past and current World's Fairs. Before we go any further, is the screen with my slideshow up? Or great, okay. Now, I'm sure, as Jack just mentioned, many of you know we have just begun our semi-quincentennial year, marking the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I will talk a little bit about some of the plans for that celebration at the end of my talk. But tonight, I really want to focus on the semi-quin's troubled predecessor from a century ago, the 1926 Sesquicentennial International Exposition, or the Sesqui for short. The Sesqui was Philadelphia's second full-fledged World's Fair and the very unsuccessful successor to the very successful Centennial of 1876. Most of this presentation is taken from my book, Sesqui, Greed, Graft, and the Forgotten World's Fair of 1926. Now, sesqui is a Latinate term meaning and a half. So a sesquicentennial is a centennial and a half, or 150 years. This promotional poster for the Sesqui features Laura LaPlante, a popular Hollywood starlet of the era, very snugly wrapped in the American flag, teetering atop the Liberty Bell, the official symbol of the Sesqui, and holding aloft the glittering wonders of the future fair in her shapely arms. Her somewhat precarious perch serves as a very apt metaphor for the fate of the fair. The Sesqui is a fascinating example of how the best intentions can be sunk by political corruption, greed, hubris, plus enough rainy weather to capsize Noah's Ark. Although the Sesqui lasted a mere 7 months, it cast a long shadow on its host city. In many ways, 1926 was high noon for Philadelphia as a major metropolis and as the workshop of the world. The ramifications of the Sesqui and the shadow that it would cast on Philadelphia would haunt the city for much of the 20th century. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, in 1876, Philadelphia hosted a World's Fair that really set the standard for years to come. The Centennial in West Fairmount Park attracted over 10 million visitors at a time when the entire population of the United States was less than 50 million. The Centennial was really the first international exposition in the United States, and it trumpeted America's status as both a unified nation and an emerging world power, and it confirmed Philadelphia's status as a modern industrial city of the first order. The directors of the Centennial included the most prominent men and women in Philadelphia, including a 38-year-old merchant named John Wanamaker, who had opened a men's and boys' clothing store in 1861. His new store at the corner of 13th and Market Streets, opened just a few weeks before the Centennial opened, was called the Grand Depot, but it attracted so many World's Fair visitors that it became known as the Centennial Annex. The success of the Centennial would spur a succession of international expositions in America throughout the rest of the 19th century. One of the most notable was the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition, also known as the White City. Well, 40 years after the centennial, John Wanamaker, department store magnate, philanthropist, and former postmaster general, decided that the time had come for his hometown to host another World's Fair. Still going strong at 78, Wanamaker was now the acknowledged grand old man of Philadelphia. His department store, now housed in a monumental palazzo designed by Daniel Burnham, the Wizard of the White City, was considered one of the largest and most luxurious in the world. In 1916, Wanamaker began to promote the idea of Philadelphia hosting a sesquicentennial in 1926 to celebrate America's 150th birthday. So we have Mr. Wanamaker to thank for that somewhat tongue-twisting name. Besides helping to heal a world rent by global war, Wanamaker thought that the Sesqui would also both transform and reform his hometown. Now, in 1916, Philadelphia was still the third largest city in America, and it was still an industrial powerhouse, truly the workshop of the world. But Penn's green country town had devolved into a grim, dingy metropolis filled with sooty, obsolete Victorian architecture. The Schuylkill River was little more than an open sewer. Civic leaders hoped to remodel Philadelphia with the new Fairmount Parkway. Today we call it the Ben Franklin Parkway, designed by Frenchmen Jacques Kléber and Paul-Philippe Clay. The Fairmount Parkway would be only the first of a number of projects that would transform gritty Philadelphia into a true city beautiful. Crête and Kléber hoped to replicate the parkway with other grand boulevards radiating from central circles similar to those in Paris. The squalid Chinese Wall, the elevated viaduct that carried Pennsylvania Railroad trains between Broad Street Station and West Philadelphia, would be demolished and replaced with elegant office blocks. A modern mass transit system of subways and electric trolleys would link every corner of the spread out city, just like they had in New York, Boston, and Chicago. And a new bridge would span the Delaware River, connecting Camden with Philadelphia. Wanamaker also hoped that the sesquicentennial would reform Philadelphia, which had gained a reputation as one of the most politically corrupt cities in the United States. This was the period of Lincoln Steffen's Corrupt and Contented in The Shame of the Cities. Between 1876 and 1916, Philadelphia's municipal government had been taken over by an omnipotent Republican machine known as the organization. The organization's top dog was U.S. Senator Boyce Penrose, one of the biggest men, both literally and figuratively, in the United States Senate. But Penrose's power was being usurped by two brothers from the south of Philadelphia, Edwin Vere and his younger brother, William Vere. The two brothers had grown up poor on a farm in the Neck, the rural lower section of South Philadelphia, described by one historian as, quote, the glory of the squatter who raised pigs, children, and hell in just about equal proportions. The Veres established a trash hauling business, which made sense because the Neck was Philadelphia's dumping ground. From there, they moved into street cleaning, using their growing political clout to win over $20 million in contracts over a 20-year period. During the same period, Philadelphia gained a reputation as having the filthiest streets of any American city. Soon, the Veres had moved into construction and contracting. By 1916, the Dukes of South Philadelphia managed over $100 million in municipal contracts and were gaining complete control of City Hall. By now, Ed Vere was a member of the Pennsylvania Senate, while Bill had moved from being a city councilman to a member of the United States House of Representatives. Meanwhile, John Wanamaker's plans for a second World's Fair had been derailed by America's entry into the Great War in 1917. But once the war was over, Wanamaker began to boost the Sesqui once again. French-born Paul-Philippe Cret, the head of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, detailed a preliminary plan for the Sesqui. Not surprisingly, his design centered on the new Fairmount Parkway. A triumphal entrance at Logan Square, which would be refigured as Logan Circle, would welcome visitors to the fairground. The circle itself would be surrounded by new civic structures, not just a new library, but a concert hall, a municipal auditorium, and a hall of justice. The upper parkway would be lined with exposition buildings that, after the fair, would house civic organizations and institutions from around the city. And of course, the cherry atop this huge sundae would be a new museum of art atop the Fairmount Plateau. New bridges on the Schuylkill River would carry visitors past ornamental gardens and cascading fountains to the old Centennial grounds and to the Philadelphia Zoo. On the east bank, a new municipal stadium and athletic fields would be erected. Cret's visionary plan would have transformed not just the Schuylkill River, but the city's entire northwestern quadrant, and it would have established the parkway as a true Champs-Élysées. But sadly, these designs soon sank in the mire of Philadelphia politics. John Wanamaker, the Sesqui's biggest backer, died at the end of 1922. Mayor J. Hampton Moore, who was the mayor at the time, was a foe of the Veres and the organization, while meanwhile nearly all of City Hall was firmly in the Veres pocket. So for the next 3 years, little happened with the Sesqui or with anything else in Philadelphia, while Mayor Moore and the Veres battled for control. The Sesqui appeared dead in the water until the city's receiver of taxes, W. Freeland Kendrick, was elected mayor in November 1923. Kendrick, a suave and charismatic politician, saw the Sesqui as a great way to promote Philadelphia and his own political future. He arranged to have himself named president of the moribund Sesquicentennial Exhibition Association, the fair's governing body, which he promptly packed with other fair allies, such as City Council President Charles Hall. Kendrick announced that the Sesqui would run from June 1st to December 1st, 1926. He also made a surprise announcement about the fair's location. The Sesqui would take place not on the new Fairmount Parkway, but instead in and around League Island Park, just above the Navy Yard at the southern end of Philadelphia. League Island Park had been partially laid out by the Olmsted brothers before World War I, but development had stopped when war was declared. The semi-developed park just happened to be adjacent to the Neck. Meanwhile, the Neck remained a marshy area dotted with shanties, ash heaps, and farms. It was still the most remote, desolate, and poverty-stricken area in Philadelphia. There was only one paved road and one trolley line connecting it with Center City. A panel of engineers and designers a few years earlier had rated the Neck 13th out of 13 potential sites for the Sesqui, while rating Fairmount Park and the Parkway as number one. Well, like everything else in Philadelphia, this dubious decision was politically motivated. The Neck was deep in the heart of the 1st Congressional District, aka Vairsville. This was the domain of U.S. Congressman William S. Vair, who is now Philadelphia's undisputed political boss after the deaths of his brother Ed and Senator Boyce Penrose. Oh, and did I mention that he grew up in the neighborhood, that he still lived nearby, and that he owned a lot of property there? Kendrick, excuse me, Kendrick had gotten his start in city government by becoming Vair's protege, and he was still very much Vair's puppet. So, by moving the World's Fair to South Philadelphia, Kendrick was delivering thousands of jobs to his patrons' loyal constituents, along with infrastructural improvements like sewers, paved streets, streetlights, etc. And Vair also benefited personally, just because the land he owned there rose in value, but also because his construction company gained some very lucrative contracts. Plans were drawn up for a new sesquicentennial at the southern foot of Broad Street, just above the Navy Yard. This is League Island at the very southern tip of the city. So here you have a special entrance at what is now Oregon Marconi Plaza. It was called Oregon Plaza then. You have the main entrance at Packer Avenue, the main exhibition halls, the Gladway or entertainment area, Pattison Avenue, a new sports stadium, and state and foreign pavilions. So this was the new improved Sesqui. The city architect, John Molitor, was charged with drafting the designs for the Sesquicentennial and its major structures. He was assisted by a small staff, including a recent graduate from the University of Pennsylvania named Louis I. Kahn, seen in the center at right. The main Sesqui buildings produced by Molitor's office would be painted in bright pastel hues and illuminated by colored lights at night, giving the Sesqui the sobriquet of the Rainbow City. The building's clean lines and lack of ornamentation, these were basically giant warehouses, meant that they could be built cheaply and quickly. Only the corner towers were excessively decorated. The first thing Sesqui visitors would encounter would be an 80-foot tall, 42-ton replica of the Liberty Bell, the official Sesqui symbol, studded with 26,000 light bulbs. The gigantic bell would straddle South Broad Street at Oregon Avenue. Once inside the fairgrounds, visitors would encounter the second wonder of the Sesqui, the 175-foot tall Tower of Light. From its rounded dome, the Light of Independence, constructed of the two largest searchlights ever built, would turn night into day for miles around. The fair's permanent legacy would include a massive sports stadium with a capacity of 100,000. A new stadium had been a priority for Philadelphia ever since it lost the Army Navy game to New York because Franklin Field was too small. But before ground could be broken for any of these wonders, the marshy land of League Island Park had to be drained and nearly 2 million cubic yards of landfill brought in. Not a problem. We're building a new subway up on North Broad Street, so we'll simply pay a contractor to truck all of that land from North Broad Street to the other end of South Broad Street. Well, not only did this delay construction for months, but it also added millions of dollars to the cost of the fair. The Sesqui was effectively insolvent before it opened. This is an aerial view of the Sesqui grounds, showing Oregon Plaza looking north toward City Hall, taken toward the end of 1925. I would say 7 or 8 months before opening day. As you can see, not a lot of buildings. By the end of 1925, the city had received no funds from either the federal government or the state government. The city had spent about $10 million of its own money so far on the fair, but most of that had gone for trucking in all that landfill to prepare the site. Sesqui Finance Director Albert M. Greenfield, Philadelphia's leading realtor and a strong ally of the fair organization, directed an 11th hour bond issue, which raised $3 million for the Sesqui from local individuals and businesses. This allowed construction to begin on the Liberty Bell and the major structures, but it still fell far short of the Sesqui's budget of $20 million. Congress waited until March 1926, 3 months before opening day, to allocate $3 million in federal aid. The Sesqui had been hoping for $10 to $20 million. Resistance to the fair was very strong among Democratic politicians who saw it basically as a big boondoggle by the Republican organization. The Sesqui also got little help from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Bill Vair was conducting a running feud with Gifford Pinchot, the reform-minded governor of the state. Just as the Sesqui was starting, Vair ran against Pinchot for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania and won. In retaliation, Pinchot made sure that not 1 cent of state funds went to support the Sesqui in general. So the bulk of the Sesqui's cost would have to come from either private donations or the increasingly cash-strapped city treasury. Plans were canceled for many projects while corners were cut on the surviving one. Before the Sesqui opened, the Inquirer published a report investigating shoddy construction practices at the new stadium and even suggested that the entire structure was unsafe. Mayor Kendrick took to riding around the fair site on horseback, supervising construction. Now, by this time, many people were advising, really begging is the right term, for the fair to be delayed for a year. And this was very common with World's Fairs. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair was originally scheduled for 1892. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was scheduled for 1903. Both were delayed for a year to raise more money. Both were huge successes. But Kendrick not only refused to delay the fair until 1927, despite promises from the federal government that they would substantially increase their donations, he actually moved opening day up 24 hours from June 1st to May 31st. Why? Well, Kendrick was a former imperial potentate or supreme ruler of the Imperial Order of the Mystic Shrine. Those are the Shriners, the guys in the fezzes driving around in the little cars. This sheet music has his portrait in the middle, showing him in his potentate robes. Kendrick had persuaded his fellow Shriners to hold their national convention in Philadelphia by promising to open the Sesquicentennial on Memorial Day, the same day as their opening day. And so about 250,000 Shriners began to show up in Philadelphia at the end of May for the Sesqui. So the Sesqui was going to open on Memorial Day, come hell or high water. And it did with more than a little of both. The Memorial Day Monday, thousands of Shriners from around the country attended the Sesqui opening. They out a very meager crowd of about 20,000 spectators because a big thunderstorm had chased away many of the visitors. At Oregon Avenue, raincoat clad visitors watched the opening day parade proceed under a Liberty Bell that was still shrouded in scaffolding. In 1876, the high-powered duo of President Ulysses S. Grant and Emperor Dom Pedro of Brazil opened the centennial. In 1926, the star attractions were Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg and Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, neither of whom was exactly a scintillating speaker. Neither President Calvin Coolidge nor Governor Pinchot attended opening day. The only moment of opening day which captured the public's imagination occurred after dark when the giant Liberty Bell was illuminated. Its 26,000 bulbs turned it into a glowing beacon of light, visible over 3 miles away at City Hall. But little else about the Sesqui in its opening days proved to be inspirational. The only fully operational pavilion was the government post office. You could mail yourself a letter and watch it get canceled. The large palaces were nearly empty except for workmen unpacking shipping crates, and ground hadn't even been broken yet for many of the smaller pavilions. After 3 days, the Shriners went home, telling their friends across America, don't bother with Kendrick's Carnival. It was a public relations fiasco from which the Sesqui would never recover. Only about 270,000 people visited the fair during its first full month. They had been expecting at least 5 million. Well, after its disastrous debut, the Sesqui gradually pulled itself together. And by the end of July, most of its exhibits were up and running. But there always existed a big gap between the glowing vision of the fair and its somewhat mundane reality. This is a photo showing the main entrance at Packer Avenue, south of the Liberty Bell. As you can see, it's not exactly a whirlwind of activity. But add some pastel hues, paint in half a dozen aircraft, and voila, nearly every postcard of the Sesqui looks like there's a dogfight occurring overhead. That's because they all have airplanes and dirigibles drawn into them to show how the Sesqui was representing the wonderful world of tomorrow. Below Packer Avenue, Broad Street opened into the Forum of the Founders. The Forum was flanked on the east by the two main exhibition halls, the Palace of Liberal Arts and Manufactures and the Palace of Agriculture and Foreign Exhibits. This, again, is the hand-tinted official view, and this is how it appeared in real life. You might notice this odd-looking structure located between the two palaces. It sort of looks like a fire ranger's tower. Well, this is all that ever got built of the much vaunted Tower of Light. The Sesqui planners got this far and simply gave up in mid-July when they ran out of money. This skeletal structure would loom over the central plaza of the fair for the duration. Unfortunately, since so much material had been printed in advance, the image of the ghost tower that never was would haunt fairgoers until closing day. What amazes me is that it took $365,000 in 1926 dollars to get the tower, to its rudimentary stage on the left. And today, that would equate to about $5 million. And even with the higher costs of labor, you can still build a pretty nice tower for $5 million. But this gives you some idea of the padded bills, the backroom deals, all of the graft and stealing that was going on with most of the Sesqui construction. The Palace of Liberal Arts and Manufactures housed the output of American factories in fanciful displays. At the Boyertown Casket Company's Egyptian Mausoleum, you could buy a solid gold bronze casket with Canton crepe upholstery, similar to the one in which the late Chinese president, Dr. Sun Yat sen, had rested for the past 18 months. The Palace of Agriculture and Foreign Exhibits housed the handful of foreign displays that allowed the Sesqui to call itself a World's Fair. The photo at right shows Mayor and Mrs. Kendrick before the Japanese exhibit. The Palace of Fine Arts was home to 10,000 works of art by American and foreign artists. On display were over 100 works by the French sculptor Auguste Rodin, collected by Philadelphia theater magnate and Sesqui director Jules Mastbaum. After the Sesqui, the Rodin collection would move to a new museum on the Parkway, a gift of Mastbaum's estate. The Civic Auditorium housed 10,000 and boasted one of the largest organs in the world, a magnificent instrument that cost over $150,000. You also had the Palace of Education and Social Economy, dedicated to the advances in social science that had been made. One of the most popular exhibits was for the 3-year-old American Eugenics Society, which hoped to improve mankind's physical and mental state by applying the principles of animal husbandry to human breeding. Most of the buildings were pretty generic in design, but a few structures showed some real architectural merit. Among them was the Pennsylvania State Building, designed by modernist architect Ralph Benker. It was considered the architectural gem of the Sesqui. It was filled with works by Pennsylvania's leading artists, including Daniel Garber's A Wooded Watershed, an oversized depiction of the Delaware Water Gap. Today, this painting graces the Michener Art Museum in Doylestown. One of the most popular exhibits was the High Street of 1776, an imaginary recreation of a Revolutionary era market street lined with reconstructions of 22 historic but vanished buildings. This exhibit was sponsored by the Women's Committee of the Sesquicentennial. It was bookended at one end by the Old Town Hall and Courthouse, and at the other end by the Farmers Market. And in between were 10 historic buildings on each side of the street, including Ben Franklin's print shop, the President's House, and William Penn's slate roof house. Dedicated on June 5th, and as you can see, it was also still under construction, High Street became one of the most popular exhibits at the Sesqui, attracting over 55,000 visitors a day. Thanks to the skillful management of the Women's Committee, High Street was also one of the few attractions at the Sesqui to turn a profit. On July 5, 1926, President Coolidge dedicated the Sesqui officially before a crowd of 40,000 at the stadium. Coolidge came on Monday, July 5th, because Independence Day was a Sunday. Many religious Americans were furious that the Sesqui had decided to open its doors on the Sabbath, and they boycotted the fair. Coolidge, not wanting to get caught up in the political brouhaha, waited a day and sidestepped. He only spent a couple of hours at the Sesqui before dashing off for visits to Independence Hall and then across the new Delaware River Bridge, which had just been finished, to dedicate both it and a tree on the Camden side of the Delaware River. Well, his timing was perfect. On Independence Day, a heavy rainstorm wrecked the Sesqui, washing away roads and damaging buildings. Workmen had to cut a hole in the flat roof of the Palace of Agriculture after tons of water had collected there, and the entire building was in danger of collapse. The resulting cascade destroyed many of the exhibits below. And needless to say, many conservative Christians felt that this was God's punishment for the fair opening on Sunday. The Sesqui holds the record as the most waterlogged World's Fair ever. It rained on 107 of the fair's 184 days, including 19 of its 26 weekends. By August, many of the hastily constructed structures were crumbling under the constant barrage of moisture. Well, despite all of these problems, there were wonderful things to do and see at the Sesqui. On September 23rd, the stadium hosted over 120,000 spectators who watched Gene Tunney defeat Jack Dempsey for the World Heavyweight Boxing title. And guess what? It was raining. This was the one night during the entire 7 months of the Sesqui when it was impossible to find a hotel room in Philadelphia. At the Spanish Pavilion, visitors could enjoy rare paintings by Goya and Velázquez. The Japanese displays of dancing and theater fascinated Americans as much in 1926 as they had at the Centennial 50 years earlier. The Fine Arts Palace introduced Americans not just to Rodin, but to such little known artists as Matisse, Kandinsky, and Chagall. A steady stream of celebrities enlivened Philadelphia during the Sesqui. Everybody from Gertrude Aderly, the English Channel swimmer, to silent screen siren Gloria Swanson, seen setting off a cannon, March King John Philip Sousa, Crown Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden, and Her Most Serene Highness Queen Marie of Romania. On steamy days, visitors could take a cool gondola ride on Edgewater Lake, serenaded by a genuine Venetian gondolier, and then dance the Charleston under the stars and hope to win a silver cup. But after rising throughout the summer, attendance plummeted after September. Talks of continuing the Sesqui into 1927 were abandoned. When the Sesqui breathed its last at midnight on December 31st, 1926, it was a ghost town. Paid admissions totaled 4.5 million. That was less than half the number of paying visitors for the 1876 centennial, despite the fact that the US population had nearly tripled from 38 million to 106 million during this time. Plus, you had little inventions like the car and the airplane that should have made it a lot easier to get to a World's Fair. At first, Sesqui officials announced that the fair would run a modest deficit of $200,000. But then all of the padded bills began to pour in. By early 1927, the size of the Sesqui deficit had mushroomed to over $6 million. Unable to cope, the Sesquicentennial Exhibition Association declared bankruptcy. Thousands of Philadelphians who had purchased Sesqui bonds to finance their hometown fair found that their investments were worthless. To pay the bills, the city government held the Great Fire Sale of 1927, a massive auction of Sesqui structures and fixtures at the desolate fairgrounds. The Sesqui managers had spent, roughly $3 million to build the fair's 5 main structures. The combined auction price was $52,701. Less than 2% of their original cost. Normally, you expect salvage cost to come in anywhere from 5 to 10% of the original outlay. All of the buildings were demolished quickly. Many, the critics charged, to obscure the padded cost of their construction. The Austin organ in the auditorium, which had cost $150,000, was nearly knocked down to a curio dealer for $1,250. At the last moment, publisher Cyrus Curtis paid $50,000 for it and donated it to the University of Pennsylvania. Today, it resides at the Irvine Auditorium. The Pennsylvania State Building, considered the architectural gem of the fair, was sold for under $10,000. It had cost nearly $500,000. Outgoing Governor Gifford Pinchot rushed to make sure that it was demolished before he left office, lest the building become a perennial fixture in Vair-controlled Philadelphia. All 22 buildings of the High Street of 1776, which cost roughly $200,000, were sold for $1,750. The Sesqui's 2 major landmarks, the Tower of Light and the Liberty Bell, suffered especially ignoble fates. The Tower of Light, known as the Sesqui Folly, or the light that failed, fetched $1,050. And remember, it had cost over $365,000 to build. The giant Liberty Bell at Oregon Plaza, which had cost roughly $100,000, was knocked down for $60. Of course, it was cash and carry. You had to take it away with you. Local residents were by this point very happy to see it go because its hollow stanchions had become hobo hotels. A few buildings were moved elsewhere and repurposed, but most of the Sesqui was either dismantled for raw materials or else simply smashed into smithereens. In 1934, a newspaper reporter visited the Sesqui site on the 8th anniversary of the World's Fair. She found a bleak, desolate landscape where the only relics of the fair were the rarely used municipal stadium and a couple of automobile graveyards. Piles of rubble from the demolished pavilions would remain a fixture of the neighborhood for over the next decade. Meanwhile, Chicago was wrapping up the second year of its highly successful and profitable World's Fair, the Century of Progress Exposition, despite the rampaging depression. In an act of architectural karma, its landmark structure was the Hall of Science, designed by the same Paul-Philippe Cret, whose visionary design for the Sesqui had been discarded by the organization. Now, trying to look at the bottom line, officially, Philadelphia spent over $33 million on the fair, including site development, and sustained an official loss of nearly $10 million. Adjusted for simple inflation, that becomes $585 million cost and a $177 million loss. When you factor in the cost of labor, which has really soared, then suddenly you're looking at $2.4 billion cost and $714 million loss. I have to point out, though, that given the Byzantine accounting and bookkeeping and all of the backroom deals, that we will never know the official cost and loss for the fair. But I would easily estimate it to be 3 to 5 times the official figures. City Hall covered the expenses with a bond issue and by transferring funds earmarked for other improvements. The Sesqui is a key reason why there are no rapid transit lines running to either Roxborough or the far northeast, and why Frank Gehry a few years back converted what was meant to be the Art Museum subway station into additional galleries. But the runaway cost of the Sesqui, combined with those of the Parkway and Art Museum, the Broad Street subway, the Free Library, the Delaware River Bridge, Byberry State Hospital, and all the other major projects from the high-flying 20s drove Philadelphia to insolvency well before the Depression hit. Months before the stock market crash, unemployment in Philadelphia had crept up to 10%, nearly 3 times the national average. Well before Hooverville entered the English language, homeless camps were springing up on the former Sesqui site and on the banks of the Schuylkill below the new art museum. More importantly, the Sesqui, described by one wag as the flop heard round the world, left deep scars on the Philadelphia psyche long before the economy tanked. Before the Sesqui, Philadelphia may have been a gray, dull city, but it was a gray, dull city that knew how to get things done. After the Sesqui, the city was a national laughingstock. The Sesqui may have been when Philadelphia started to go from corrupt and contented to corrupt and discontented. And of course, this discontent would intensify as the Depression deepened. Still, it would be 1951 before Philadelphia elected a Democratic mayor. Over the years, the Sesqui site has been whittled away. The area around the stadium became the sports center we know today, while the area north of Pattison Avenue and west of Broad Street has been developed. Only FDR Park, as the remaining section of League Island Park was renamed in the 1940s, bears some resemblance to the Sesqui footprint, with Edgewater Lake, the swimming pool, and the lagoon clearly recognizable. But the former pavilions and palaces have been replaced by playing fields and recreation areas, in one of the most heavily used parks in Philadelphia. Few signs of the Sesqui remain today. The Sesqui, or Municipal Stadium, renamed JFK Stadium in 1964, survived until 1992, home to the Army Navy Games and rock concerts like Live Aid. Today, its site is occupied by the Xfinity Mobile Arena and surrounded by the rest of the current sports complex. So the next time you're stuck in traffic for hours trying to get to or from a sports game, blame the Sesqui. The Lookout Gazebo, itself a leftover from the 1912 Olmsted Brothers design of League Island Park, still survives, as does the nearby boathouse, another Olmsted Brothers contribution. The only real Sesqui survivor is its police station, which is now incorporated into the new Welcome Center for FDR Park, part of its multi-million-dollar redevelopment. And finally, we have the American Swedish Historical Museum. But it's really not fair to call this a Sesqui survivor. Its cornerstone was laid in the opening days of the fair, but the building itself would not open for business until the 1930s. Well, I want to take a couple of minutes and jump ahead to see what the newly begun semi-quincentennial year holds in store for us. Sadly, the traditions of dissension and division that marred the Sesqui seem to be occurring once again. The America 250 Foundation, the official planning arm commissioned by Congress in 2016, has been paralyzed by infighting, leadership changes, and even charges of misuse of funds and sexual harassment. An associated but separate nonprofit group, the America 250 organization, has been moving ahead with its own plans, such as an essay contest called America's Field Trip, but its overall activities also appear to be limited. Things look much more promising on a local scale, where city and state organizations and leaders have joined together to plan events. In 2016, the Daughters of the American Revolution announced a grant of $380,000 to plant 76 commemorative trees throughout Philadelphia's in the years leading up to 2026. The first trees were planted at Bartram's Garden in 2018. A couple of years ago, another tree was planted here at Independence Square. The 2026 Major League Baseball All-Star Game will be hosted by the Phillies at Citizens Bank Park, while Lincoln Financial Field will host the FIFA World Cup games. In March, the city will host the first and second rounds of the NCAA Division I men's basketball tournament at the Xfinity Mobile Arena. The city will also invest in the revitalization of Lemon Hill in Fairmount Park as the location of a World Cup Fan Fest, a requirement of the FIFA contract for 2026. The city has also committed $100 million to neighborhood initiatives through its Ring It On, One Philly, a United Celebration program. The city will beautify 20 commercial corridors and undertake other civic improvements. Beginning in July 2024, the Philadelphia Historic District Partners began to host a patriotic celebration called the Red, White, and Blue To-Do. It was held again in 2025 and will take place on July 4th of this year. In 2024 and 2025, Carpenters Hall hosted the Young People's Continental Congress, bringing together young delegates from across the country to engage in civic dialogue. This too will be repeated in 2026. And in beginning last year, Philadelphia partnered with the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps to celebrate their 250th birthday celebration. As part of the celebration, plans are in place to build a replica of the Tun Tavern, birthplace of the Marines. Actually, there appear to be two competing plans to build two Tun Taverns, resulting in the 1 ton and 2 ton designation. And the First Bank of the United States is being renovated and transformed into a museum of the American economy. The week of July 4th, 2026 will consist of a series of special events, including the Blue Angels, 8 Navy ships, 2 Coast Guard cutters, and an armada of historic and replica Navy ships. A special TED Democracy series will honor the critical role of Philadelphia in the founding of the United States and will discuss the future of democracy in our country. And finally, on July 4th, 2026, a time capsule will be buried, scheduled to be unearthed on July 4th, 2076, the 500th anniversary of the Declaration, or the quincentennial. So, will the semi-quin join the 1876 centennial as one of Philadelphia's great successes? Will it rank with the 1926 Sesqui and the 1976 bicentennial as a disappointment? Or will it fall somewhere in between the two? You'll just have to check back with me in a few years after I've written the sequel. In the meantime, thank you very much and happy semi-quincentennial.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was absolutely fascinating. And of course, very timely as we embark on the semi-quincentennial year. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll relay them to Tom. I have a couple of, I don't know if they're questions or statements, but the Women's Committee that oversaw the, historic Market Street, aren't they the ones that now manage Strawberry Mansion? Aren't they still around?
Strawberry Mansion.
Yeah.
Actually, as part of their Sesqui activities, they took I think Mount Pleasant, I forget, one of the mansions that the Museum of Art had just renovated. They filled it with antique furniture and they mounted an exhibition just in the space of a few weeks that attracted thousands of people. And so that compelled them, hey, let's find another mansion and take it over and make it, a success, which they did with Strawberry Mansion. And their results really led to, I think, the founding of the colonial chain in Fairmount Park during the depths of the Depression. The fact that there was this interest in people saving and restoring historic buildings despite the economic downturn made a huge difference in Philadelphia. Some people have even posited that the High Street was the inspiration for colonial Williamsburg, or that the plans were already under discussion for it, but the success of High Street convinced the Rockefeller family to back colonial Williamsburg. So these ladies, it's a beam of competence and organizational skill in the midst of an otherwise very gray picture.
Yeah, the Women's Committee is still going strong.
Yes,
so
it
there's
is.
a couple of comments. Well, there's a lot of congratulations and compliments on the, fantastic talk. I can't read them all. Sam Katz wrote that the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts and the Middleton family will collaborate to host A Nation of Artists, a 17-month exhibition of American history through the lens of our artists and their art. So that's something we can look forward to. What somebody asked, what happened? I think you talked about this. What happened to the giant Liberty Bell in the High Street recreation? I think you
it was dismantled for its raw materials, all of the copper wiring and the metal and stuff. That's why it sold for so little, because they had to basically demolish it and tear it down to its key things. But it was demolished. Just about everything. It's funny. I spoke a few years ago to the head of the American Swedish Historical Museum, and she said that they still have to be careful when they're doing plantings around the museum, because if they dig down too far, they usually end up running, banging into rubble from the old Sesqui buildings that was covered over. It's still very much it's under the surface, as it were. By the way, I just want to give, if you don't mind, Jack, if people have questions that don't get answered or if they have any follow-up, I have a website that they can go to. It's www Thomas Keels, ThomasKeels, all one word, and .com. And they can find it on Google. And if they can send me an email through that site if they have any questions or want any more information, and I'll be very happy to get back to them.
Great. Um, and also another, I don't know, I guess it's a question or I just wrote a book on the history of the Mann Center and the Robin Hood Dell, and it turns out that all the people that were leaders of the music committee for the sesquicentennial were the ones that came together 4 years later to see, that the Robin Hood Dell got built. Albert J. Tilley, who was the president of Strawbridge and Clothier, but also an active musician, headed that committee. Can you talk a little bit about the music that went on there? Because it was pretty substantial. And then all those people really made a mark on Philadelphia music heritage a couple of years later.
Excuse me. Yes, in particular, Clara Abbott, who
Yes.
I believe would go on. She was in charge of the Sesquicentennial Chorus, which consisted of 5,000 members from various musical groups and choirs from around the city. Um, Unfortunately, there is a sort of a dark side to this. The only people who were not represented were African Americans. Miss
Right.
Abbott went out of her way to make sure that African Americans were excluded from the Sesqui chorus, um, which became quite a bit of a scandal. But music was, and pageantry and drama were very much integral parts of the Sesqui. The auditorium hosted concerts by Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra, by other visiting musical groups, by the chorus. There were these huge spectacles like America with thousands of actors and dancers, which unfortunately lost its shirt because it began raining for almost every performance and it was an outside spectacle. But music was everywhere at the Sesqui. And we did see John Philip Sousa, his band performed there. There were many other bands performing there. So it was a lively place. I know that it sounds, I really diss it, but there were some fun things going on there.
Right. Yeah. And that Clara Barnes Abbott would be appointed the director of the Philadelphia Music Office. There was a Philadelphia
Yes.
Bureau of Music that was created in 1928 and it lasted until about 1931. But based on her role at the Sesqui, she parlayed that into this position with with the city of Philadelphia. Yeah.
Yeah, she was very well connected.
Right.
And she did do wonderful things for the city's music.
Right.
But at any rate,
Right. Um, Another question. After the Centennial buildings were moved and reused, was the shoddy construction the reason that didn't happen?
that was one of them. These were not buildings that were built to last. I mean, the fact that you had this huge exhibit hall that practically collapsed in on itself because of water collecting on its flat roof gives you some idea. We do know that the building standards were loosened, shall we say, several times prior to construction just to meet the ever shrinking budget, to the point where Molitor, the city architect, was fired because he couldn't deal with, building buildings. He sort of quit slash was fired because he couldn't build such shoddy buildings. That was part of it. Part of it was just that they were in such a rush to try to earn some money by getting buildings sold. And it's a shame because, as I said, there were some fascinating buildings. The Pennsylvania State Building should have remained in place, but that was sort of a victim of a political feud. There were some other buildings, the Spanish Pavilion, the Persian Pavilion, a few countries did put up pavilions, the Cuban Pavilion, etc. Argentina. that were beautiful, but they were basically sort of requisitioned by the city. And it's like, you know, something, sell them, get what we can, and then, you know, tear them apart for the base elements. It was very sad. There are a couple of buildings that got recycled. One building, I believe, became a church in southern New Jersey. Um, Sulgrave Manor was put together by the Colonial Dames of America. It was a copy of the ancestral home of the Washingtons in England, and that became an elegant residence on Willow Grove Avenue in Chestnut Hill. So, but most of them, no, they were torn down before they fell down of their own accord.
Another question: is there any film of the Sesqui?
Yes, evidently there is. You know, moving pictures were a big thing, and there are numerous home movies. If you go to YouTube, you can come across them. There was no official film of the Sesqui itself, but they did make a historical pageant, a for the Sesqui that was shown at the Sesqui about the founding of the United States with the wigged actors in Independence Hall and other historic buildings. And parts of it still survive and are available at the city archives. Again, you can see bits of them on YouTube, but I don't think the entire film has survived.
Okay. And then one last question: who was the building general contractor? I think you sort of described some of this, but
Well, the contractors, there were several contractors. The Ver Construction Company popped up a surprisingly high number of times. Pure
really.
coincidence, I'm sure. But there were basically an approved list of contractors. These were people who were giving substantial kickbacks to the organization. It was definitely a pay to play situation. If you wanted a contract, you had to make sure that checks went to all the right people. I do mention them in the book, but I don't know their names offhand aside from the Veers.
Actually, this one extra further question, which relates to your recent answer: was there any comeuppance for the feckless politicians?
Well, there was sort of a Sesqui curse. Bill Ver, basically, he wanted to use the Sesqui as a backdrop for his senatorial campaign. Bill wanted to be a U.S. senator, and he was elected senator, but they would not seat him. Gifford Pinchot and his other political foes brought suit. They accused him of political fraud. They accused him of reckless spending, etc. So if you go to the U.S. Senate and look up William S. Fair, you'll see a big asterisk next to his name because they would not seat him. He suffered a stroke and basically fell from power as the political boss of Philadelphia. So he sort of got his comeuppance. W. Freeland Kendrick hoped that the Sesqui would be a springboard in his political career to the governor's mansion. It effectively ended his career. He ended life as the general manager of the Benjamin Franklin Hotel, which was owned by Albert M. Greenfield. So was Greenfield sort of taking care of his old friend, W. Freeland. So, yeah, I guess you could say there was some political comeuppance.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you for an incredible presentation. So interesting, so
My
timely.
pleasure.
Yeah. And just remember, everybody, so it's the Northeast Philadelphia History Network. And the way that you stay in touch and hear about our programs and activities is through our Facebook page, the Northeast Philadelphia History Network, or we have an email list that you can get on. It's nephillyhistory@gmail.com. So either of those two ways are the ways that we communicate our activities. And remember, February 4th, for Black History Month, we're going to have a program on the Bucks County African American History Museum. And then again, mark your calendars for April 11th, which is Saturday, the Northeast Philly History Fair. So thank you so much again, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and hopefully we'll see you next month.
Thank you, guys. Have a
All
good
right.
night, everybody.
See ya.